Welcome on this night, the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill and the death of Joseph Warren. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about both. So, Warren, what is in a name? So you may know John Hancock, Paul Revere, and Sam Adams and other founding fathers, but Joseph Warren has sort of fallen out of fashion, and we're going to try to find out why. So where does the Warren name come from? It comes from the Varenne River in Normandy, France. The Normans were Vikings that invaded northern France and settled there. They then went on to invade England, Ireland, Sicily, Iberia, Africa, Byzantium, Scotland, and Wales. As you can tell, these are not people to be trifled with. William de Varenne was a cousin and accompanied William the Conqueror to England when he had an invasion of 1066. He was eventually made the Earl of Surrey, and the name was eventually anglicized to Warren. From Scandinavia to France to England to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Peter Warren was born in Boston in 1628. He is Joseph Warren's great-grandfather. Joseph Warren III, the man we were here for, was born in 1741 in Roxbury outside of Boston. He is a fourth-generation New Englander. His family had already been in America for over 100 years. His father was a prosperous farmer and considered a gentleman in the stratified puritanical society of early New England. Working on the farm, the Warrens would bring their wares to sell in Boston, and he was also exposed to many people passing through what they call the Neck. So that is a colonial map of Boston. As you can see, it's a lot different than what it is today. So Boston is actually on the Shawmut Peninsula, and is connected by land by what they call the Neck. The Neck at points was only 50 feet across. So the Boston that you see today is mostly fill and reclaimed land, because basically the size of Boston, it goes all the way down now. There is no neck. So the colonies were always short of what they call specie, which is hard money, gold and silver coins. And while you could probably pay your neighbor with a chicken, you couldn't pay your taxes or buy imported British goods with a chicken. And so the colonies tried to alleviate their economic problems with that, and they made what they called a land bank. And so this was paper currency that was issued against land as opposed to paper currency issued against gold and silver. So Parliament did not like the colonies usurping their economic control, and so they made an act and dissolved the land bank. Warren's grandfather on his mother's side and also Samuel Adams' father were heavily invested in the bank and were brought to the brink of financial ruin because of this. So in the families, there was a little animosity towards the crown already. Warren attends the Roxbury Latin School, and at age 14, he goes to Harvard. He does well his first year, but his father dies in a tragic accident on the farm, and he is now responsible for his tuition, the farm, his younger siblings, and helping his mother. So he is thrust into a leadership position. At Harvard, Warren meets many of Boston's elites, and he hones his oratorical skills. During the French and Indian Wars, he helps found Harvard's first militia unit and gains a little bit of military experience. He graduates and returns to Roxbury. He begins to teach at his former Latin school, and he joins the Freemasons. This was a society or organization that anybody who was anybody joined. And in it, he meets other founding fathers, John Hancock, Paul Revere, and other Whig politicians. He then decides to become a doctor, and he studies at Harvard. His graduating thesis was that disease is not caused by obstructions in the body. So this was a fairly revolutionary idea, because medicine at that time had not really progressed much more from what the ancient Greeks did thousands of years before that. They still used bloodletting as a popular treatment. He was also a proponent of vaccination, which was also super revolutionary. Edward Jenner had created the smallpox vaccine, and he was all in favor of it. And when Boston had a smallpox epidemic, he administered a lot of vaccines to people. He apprentices under Dr. James Lloyd, and because of being a doctor, he treats Tories, patriots, rich, poor, all alike, and he sort of transcends the social structure with being able to talk to anybody. In 1764, he marries Elizabeth Houghton, a wealthy heiress, and he has 5 children, but only 4 survive adulthood. Elizabeth, Joseph, Mary, and Richard. Unfortunately, she falls ill and dies in 1773. So, the 7 Years' War was the global conflict, which was known in North America as the French and Indian Wars. Britain fought France and Austria, and they were allied with Prussia and a couple other people. But they won, and they became the predominant power in North America. That is when the French left. And it was very expensive. And so Parliament, seeking to raise capital and funds, decided that they should tax the colonies because they protected the colonies during the war. They fought the French and Indians and saved them. And so they enacted a series of acts. The first one was the Sugar Act, which was a duty on importation of sugar. They also enacted the Stamp Act, which I'm sure people have heard from their grade school education. Everybody hated that. That was a tax on printed materials. So newspapers, legal documents, playing cards. These caused issues amongst the colonists, to say the least. And then they passed the Townshend Acts and the Intolerable Acts, which were retaliatory and punitive for the turmoil that was caused by the colonists. So after the war, there was a post-war depression in Boston, and a string of high-profile bankruptcies and a smallpox epidemic brings economic turmoil to Massachusetts. Combined with the acts, it provokes riots and violence. This is where you would hear the infamous tarring and feathering, which happened quite often to British officials and customs officers. Because of that, Boston is occupied by British regular army. On February 11th, 1770, a protest outside Ebenezer Richardson's house, a customs officer turned violent, and Richardson fires his gun into the crowd. He wounds 11-year-old Christopher Sider, who Joseph Warren treats, but he later dies at even. Some people think that he was the first, or speculated, or claim that he was the first casualty of the American Revolution. Warren also performs his autopsy. 11 days later, on March 5th, a crowd taunts soldiers, provoking them to fire in the crowd, killing 5 and wounding 6 others. This is the Boston Massacre. Joseph Warren treats the wounded and also is on the committee that reports on the event. So you can see here, this is the famous engraving by Paul Revere of the Boston Massacre, how it occurred. It's not true. So in the picture, if you can see it, there was a British officer holding a sword up, ordering the soldiers to fire into the crowd. That is not what happened. It was basically a small group of soldiers, young recruits, far from home, who got faced with an angry mob and basically feared for their lives, which they had pretty good reason to do that. And so they panicked and shot. And so there was no direct order for them to fire. But Paul Revere and Sam Adams conspired to make this engraving, to publicize it, to use it to incite animosity against the crowd. So Warren also helped treat the people who were killed in the massacre and becomes more political. He gets more involved in the radical movement, and he starts to pen different types of diatribes and criticisms of the government and broadsides in Boston. He also gives orations on the anniversary of the massacre, and he begins to gather notice of the authorities. He attends the Boston Town Meetings, which are a quasi-government outside of the Crown, and together with Sam Adams, they join the committees of correspondence to try to unite the colonies in the opposition to the Crown. So at this point in America's history, each colony was almost like a separate country. They issued their own currency, they had their own militias and armies, and people in North Carolina didn't really care what happened to people in Massachusetts. And so this was an attempt to get them to unite together. As I'm not sure if you heard a quote from Ben Franklin, but we all hang together or we all hang separately. So Adams and Warren try to drive the revolution forward. When his wife passes, he begins a romance with Mercy Scully. She shares his views and fully supports his rebellious actions. While they never marry, she cares for his children, even after his death. Because of Warren's connections with everybody, being a doctor and talking with everybody throughout the town, he develops networks and spies to keep tabs on the Crown activities. The Tea Act is passed, and what the Tea Act was, it gave the British East India Company a monopoly on selling tea directly to the consumer. So it bypassed all the British merchants, or all the Boston merchants, which they didn't like too much, because that cut them out. And also other colonies saw that and realized that maybe that Britain would impose monopolies on other goods as well. And so word is passed of ships sitting in the harbor waiting to be unloaded with tea, and a tea party ensues. So while Warren was not necessarily directly physically involved in throwing the tea over the ships, he definitely was part of the incitement, the planning, and the directing of what happened. After this, they passed the Intolerable Acts. That is a punitive thing where they dissolved the Massachusetts colonial government, they closed the port of Boston, and they also passed the Quartering Act, which required private citizens to house British soldiers in their homes. This was super unpopular, and it's why we have the Third Amendment in the Constitution. After that act was passed, Joseph Warren drafts what they call the Suffolk Resolves. And these were a bunch of resolutions that basically laid out a plan to oppose the crown. They said to boycott British goods. They wanted to reinstate the colonial government. Their refusal to pay taxes until the colonial government was reinstated, and for urging the colonies to raise their own militias and armies. This was adopted by the Massachusetts colonial government in Suffolk, Massachusetts. It was then taken by Paul Revere to Philadelphia to the First Continental Congress and endorsed by them also. It also is directly influential upon what was written in the Declaration of Independence, and some of the language is even the same. His continued agitation and organizing makes him a marked man. He becomes president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which is an illegal organization under the Crown, and he also attends the Massachusetts Committee of Safety. Now, the safety that you think is not what that is, the basically Committee of Safety is to organize, procure supplies for, and direct militia or armies. Through his spy networks, he learns of British troop movements to move to Concord to destroy a munitions dump there. They also think that they might be going out there to arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams, which they're saying that may not be true, but that's what they believed. So he sends Paul Revere and William Dawes on the famous midnight rides to War of the Patriots. So this is the one by land, two if by sea. So the two lanterns were hung in the Old North Church, which meant the British were going by water. They were rowing across the Charles River to Charlestown and taking a northern route around to Concord. This is the same ride that Paul Revere made a few hours ahead of time. And Charles Dawes goes south through the neck and warns the Patriots on the southerly route. He then rides to Concord himself in the morning. The British troops move through Lexington and Concord to seize the munitions, and Minutemen offer resistance and force the British back. Joseph Warren partakes of the fight and is nearly killed when a musket ball hits his wig. Warren is now a traitor to the crown. He loses everything. The British go back to Boston, and they are surrounded by 15,000 colonial militia. This is called the Siege of Boston. He sends his wife, or not wife, his Mercy Scully, he sends her and his children to Worcester for safekeeping. He burns all his papers and correspondence because they didn't want to have any evidence against him. And he leaves his house for the last time. So while the British are trapped in Boston by land, they need supplies, and the only way they can get supplies is through the harbor. So they send out foraging parties to raid various little islands around Boston. And each one of these, of course, is skirmishes. Joseph Warren fights in them all. And he continues to organize and procure supplies for the militias. In the 60 days between Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British have been humiliated, they've been run out of supplies, and they are looking for a strategic advantage. They realize that the only way that they can survive is through the harbor, so they decide to take the high ground around Boston to be able to secure it. Patriots intelligence gathers word of the British plans to take the high ground, and they fortify the heights around Boston. They build fortifications overnight on Breed's Hill. They dig trenches, they have a little redoubt, and they do an entire network across it. So We just call it the Battle of Bunker Hill because Bunker Hill was just behind Breed's Hill. And Bunker Hill was actually a better hill, they think, because it was a little higher. But Breed's Hill was closer to Boston, so they figured it was better to have that as a strategy. The British notice this. They do a naval bombardment, and then they decide to assault. So the British underestimated the number of patriots and their fortifications. They also held them in contempt. They called them untrained rabble, which they sort of were. These are farmers and merchants who are facing the best trained and equipped army in the world. Britain is the predominant power at this time. After the 7 Years' War, they take over North America, they solidify their control in India, and this is the beginning of that the sun never sets on the British Empire. So while the British call for more reinforcements and wait in the morning, the Patriots also call reinforcements, and among them is Joseph Warren. Even though he was commissioned as a major general in the colonial militia by the Continental Congress, he goes on the hill and asks to be a private. He felt that he did not have the military knowledge of some of the veterans that were there. And he asked to be placed where the fighting was to be the heaviest. He is dressed in his fine clothing and readily stands out and boosts morale for the troops that are there. The colonials defend the hill against two waves of British regulars. The British were unprepared. They were not equipped like they should have been. They also were going up the hill on a hot June day in their wool uniforms. And so the first two waves failed. On the third wave, they attached bayonets and they attacked the hill. Now, the equipment that the colonials will have are probably their own hunting rifles. They did not have bayonets, and they were going to have to probably defend themselves with shovels and pitchforks. So as the British went up there and took the hill, with low on ammunition, the colonials retreat, and they leave the peninsula in British hands. And so technically, the British won the Battle of Bunker Hill because they held the field after the end of the day. But it was at a great cost. So I know we all know the Battle of Bunker Hill, and I think it's important, right? We all learned that. But it's actually very important. A few things that happened to that. So the British lost had over 1,000 casualties, and they lost most of their officer corps that was located in North America because the colonials targeted them. The colonials only lost 450 men. So this was a Pyrrhic victory, as they would say, and that it set the tone for literally the next 5 years of the war. So the British never again attacked entrenched colonials on a hilltop. They would never do that. So as the New York and New Jersey campaigns later would show this, and even here in Warren, when Washington was at the Meadowbrook encampment, just down the road on Martinsville, he held the high ground where the British were in New Brunswick on the plains. Washington knew that he could never defeat the British army on open ground, and the British knew they couldn't defeat the colonials on the high ground. And so that's why in this area they just kind of danced around each other and there were no major battles. They also realized that they felt they didn't have enough manpower, and so they decided to call in for foreign mercenaries, and that is what brought the Hessians into the war. Oh, and also the whites of their eyes, you've never said. While covering the retreat, Warren is fatally shot. His body was stripped of his clothing, he was bayoneted repeatedly, and he was buried in a shallow ditch. This was not necessarily that unusual for the time period, and that is what they did with the victors did to the wounded and dead. But the upper command of British did not believe that Joseph Warren had died. So they went back there the next day and dug him up to make sure. And when they dug him up, one of the officers there spit in his face, cut off his head, and did commit all acts of violence upon his body. They then reburied him in a mass grave, and the upper command actually tried to hide this because they feared for the backlash it would cause. His body is then actually moved a few more times. A year later, Paul Revere and his brothers go and find him, and they bury him in the old granary burial ground. His body is then exhumed and then moved to St. Paul's Church. It is then exhumed again and finally buried in his family plot in Forest Hill Cemetery in Boston. So why don't we know more about Joseph Warren? Because he was so prominent early in the Revolution? Well, it's probably because he died early and he died young. So he wasn't around afterwards to write memoirs. He wasn't there to promote himself. He wasn't there to do more further actions. And he also burned all his papers and correspondence, so there's no firsthand historical record from him. His children are cared for by Mercy Scully, and she petitions the Founding Fathers and the Continental Congress for help in their care and education. And she does receive money from the Continental Congress, Samuel Adams, and even Benedict Arnold donates £1,000 for their care, because that is how important this guy was. And he basically, there's speculation that if he had not died, he would have been a very high prominent politician, and he might have even gotten command of the Continental Army. And some speculate if that happened, George Washington probably would have just been a country bumpkin from Virginia. And so we have counties, townships, ships, streets, and squares and schools named for him. And supposedly, according to the best information that we have, Warren Township is named after him because one of our founding fathers, when Warren was breaking away from Berners Township, was a big fan. And so that's why he decided to name us Warren. A big fan. So we were only about 30 years out from when the Battle of Bunker Hill happened. So he was still fresh in everybody's mind. It's only in the past 100 years or so that he has pretty much fallen out of favor. You don't hear about him in textbooks or movies or any of that. So. Well, thank you.